I'm really happy to be here. So my name is Karim Jebari. I'm a philosopher and researcher at the Institute for Future Studies in Stockholm. And our mission is to do interdisciplinary research with regards to important topics in the future. And we're really happy to have both Ole and Anders as colleagues, or I'm really happy to have them as well. So the topic for today's talk is, or the title is Resetting the Tape of History, and I will explain in a moment what I mean by that. So here's a general outline of the talk. I'm going to talk about the concept of a social collapse, which a subset of global catastrophes could result in, and how what that has to do with resetting the tape of history. I'm also gonna try to eliminate some of the consequences of a social collapse by introducing some theoretical tools from theoretical biology, especially as applied to speculations about the history of life and how the history of life could have looked like. And to generalize from there to introduce similar concepts in cultural evolution, and thereby allowing us to say something about the human history. And I want to finish by saying a few things about historical discontinuity and what kind of outcome that can lead to. And then I'm going to have some general conclusions with relevance to global catastrophic risk and risk management techniques. A lot of concepts at the moment, but hopefully it will all be clear in a few moments. So the context or the motivation for this is, well, I started thinking about these when I read Nick Bostrom's paper in Utilitas a while ago, many years ago, and where he talks about the potential of future human civilization or post-human civilization, and the huge amounts of value that could be created. And one of the implications of this potential, Nick argues, is a heuristic that he calls maxipoc, maximize the probability of an okay outcome. And among the measures that could be employed to ensure an okay outcome would be to build doomsday shelters or refuges. And this is something I've discussed in a previous paper. I know Seth has also written about it too, and Alexei also. So the general idea is to replicate some of the value that an extraplanetary colony would yield on Earth. Of course, you might not get all the benefits of a base on Mars, but you might get other benefits that a base on Mars would not have, like access to resources and a less horrible environment. And you could get, so you could get a lot of the benefits and to a much lower cost. So there was an interesting article, I think, that objected to this view that doomsday shelters or refuges would be cost-effective by Nick Baxter. And he argues that they're probably not cost-effective because if you consider all kind of hypothetical or potential catastrophes that we can think of, they seem to fall either in the category of overkill catastrophes or underkill catastrophes. So here's an image of, I don't know if you can see it, but it's a collision. This is how the moon was created. So mid-sized planets collided with Earth, and a lot of debris formed the moon. And of course, this kind of incident would kill everyone on Earth, regardless of a refuge. Other potential catastrophes that have this character could be if we all happen to live in a simulation and the simulation was shut down, yes, well, the refuge wouldn't help either. On the other hand, there are the catastrophes that are not of this overkill character seem to be of an underkill character. As I think Phil mentioned, it's really difficult to kill every single person on the planet. And most likely all these nuclear war scenarios, famine, pandemics, seem to leave a substantial fraction of humanity alive. And if this is the case, then maybe the refuge is not going to make a big difference with regards to the number of lives saved. A refuge could harbor maybe 100 or 200 or maybe even 1,000 people, the way I imagined it, or the way that's been commonly thought of in this context. And 1,000 people is not a lot of people in relation to the people who are likely to persist even after these kind of most global catastrophes. So I felt like, yeah, this is a really interesting challenge that I started thinking about. So the objection that I had is that the point of the refuges was never to save as many lives as possible, but to guarantee some kind of social continuity in the face of a catastrophe that brings about social collapse. To preserve technology, science, social institutions, practices, to preserve modern civilization, or at least as much possible of it that we know. So if this is the case, if this is the main value of the shelters, we need to consider some things to reassess this claim. Are shelters cost effective? And one of the considerations is, of course, how effective would a shelter be in preserving a group of people after a catastrophe? And that, of course, can be answered by different shelter models. Will probably be some will be more effective than others, and so on. And I think Alexei has a pretty good article about that, where he looks through different designs and talks about their advantages and disadvantages. So this article is not going to focus on the shelters, but rather on another set of considerations, which I list here. So one of them that would be that in the absence of a refuge, would a re-emergence of modern civilization, would it be soon or late? Would the civilization that re-emerges be similar to ours, or would it be alien? Here's a picture from the world of Warhammer 40K. You might be familiar with it. It's a kind of I like that fantasy. Of course, it portrays a very alien world where there's some kind of undead emperor that controls the galaxy. But perhaps most important, we need to ask ourselves if a social collapse might lead to a permanent stunting of the human condition. Of course, it would be bad enough if a catastrophe would imply a greater delay than we expect. But if it would be permanent delay, lock us in a permanent state of Hobbesian war against everyone, then of course that would be really, really bad. So if we assign a high enough probability to the possibility of a permanent stunting, then surely the refuge is going to be very cost effective. So it seems like these questions that I've asked, so just to clarify, whether or not the future or a future civilization is alien or similar to us, maybe not so important from a utilitarian hedonist perspective, but it could be important from other sets of values or value systems. So a lot of people feel that some works of art or human achievement are important because people enjoy them, understand them, and enjoy them. And if a future civilization relates to ours, as we relate to perhaps the Minoan civilization or the Indus Valley River civilization, that is civilizations that we don't understand anything about, then perhaps even if people could somehow decipher English, they might not enjoy Shakespeare in the right way. So Myself, I don't think this is not the worst thing that could happen. But a lot of people really take this kind of cultural and social and moral discussion very seriously. So I just wanted to kind of bring them into the fold. Okay, so just coming back. So the question is, can we investigate these topics rigorously, or are we can we just aimlessly speculate? Well, I unsurprisingly argue that yeah, we could. And what struck me was that there was an interesting similar discussion that took place a few decades ago in theoretical biology. And it was partly initiated by Stephen Jay Gould. I'm not sure if it was in this particular book, but he talks about this in this book. And he suggested that in the absence of some extinction events, the forms of life would have been fundamentally different. So Gould sees the history of life as kind of pockmarked by these essentially random events that just eliminate large fractions of all animals from the gene pool and remove paths that could have been taken but that weren't. And that the history of life is highly path dependent and formed by the animals that survived, so to speak. So according to Stephen Jay Gould, the forms of life are fragile. Fragile in the sense that other conditions, other initial conditions, would have brought about a different, maybe radically different outcome. Opposed to this, I mean, the other side of this argument are theoretical biologists like McGee and others that argue that no, on the contrary, life is, the forms of life or the history of life is quite robust. They argue that and that regardless of these mass killings and so on, things would have looked like pretty similar. It would have, we should expect to find things that look like fish and things that look like birds and so on, even if the ancestors of fish and bird hadn't been there in the first place. And they appeal to this well-observed phenomena, namely convergent evolution. So this is a really interesting list of animals in Australia and animals in the rest of the world, and how animals in similar niches really look remarkably similar, although their common ancestors were not very closely related. And I think the Tasmanian wolf is particularly striking. So had I not known this, I would imagine that this is, well, it should be quite closely related to wolves. And convergent evolution is ubiquitous. We can see it everywhere. So what they argue is that convergent evolution shows us that there's a limited number of solutions to environmental challenges. And you can express this in the terms that there are few degrees of freedom. If you want to transport yourself in water, it's like you probably need to have a tube-shaped body and flippers and so on. So first is that the possibilities of forms are constrained. The other one is that the evolutionary pressures are so strong that they overwhelm phylogenetic history, I mean founder effects. And this kind of clearly contradicts Gould's point because Gould's point was that you have some random animal left, and that animal's traits and characteristics are going to powerfully influence the future forms of life. And they deny this point in general. So I think this is really interesting, and in particular, a recent article by a colleague, Russell Powell and James Buchanan, analyzed these claims of convergent evolution. And I think they made an interesting point in discussing some qualifications to the evidence that an instance of convergent evolution provides to the robustness thesis. So it's not just that we can observe that convergence has occurred, we also need to consider some additional things. And this is following Russell. So one of them is, to which degree is this evolution of this trait is a convergence or is a parallel development? So to exemplify, sharks and dolphins have similar body shapes with two black bodies and flippers. And their common ancestor, most recent common ancestor, did not look like this. So it seems like this example allows us to generalize to the smallest class that encompasses both sharks and dolphins, which would be chordates. So animals with a spine and central nervous system and organs and stuff like that. So from this example seems to count in favor of the claim that if a chordate would end up living as a marine animal, then it would probably look like a shark or a dolphin. But we can generalize outside of this, because there are no non-chordates that have this familiar shape. For example, squids don't have these two black bodies, nor do they have flippers in this sense. So it's important to differentiate between convergent evolution and parallel evolution, because it allows us to say, okay, we have an instance of convergent evolution, how much does this generalize? The second thing I think we need to look at is the degree of specificity. So to say that flight is a trait that should be expected is of course true. I mean, flight has occurred so many times independently of each other that we should of course expect flight to reoccur. But flight is very unspecific. It's a much more interesting claim to say muscle-powered flight, in contrast to insect-type flight, and so on. So the degree of specificity matters to the force of the instance of convergence. And third, the degree of generality. So if some morphological traits or body plans are constrained to certain environments, then of course we can only expect those body plans or forms assuming that those environments are to be found. So for example, having flippers again, land living, well, it requires water. Land living animals don't have flippers in that way. So absent marine environments, you should not expect to find that kind of form. So you could say that flippers in this case is fragile or contingent on certain environments, and there's a whole list of similar examples. So how does this apply to cultural evolution? So you could, this is kind of a tentative claim just to try to be clear what I mean here, that a cultural outcome is fragile if it can obtain under only a specific set of circumstances. And contrary, if it's robust, if it can obtain under many different circumstances. And we can clearly see that there are some cultural practices, some things that, well, we do have a lot of really interesting cases of convergent cultural evolution. So what we can see here are calendars. I'm not sure that top left one is a calendar, but the other ones are calendars from different cultures. So I think this one in the middle to the left is from the Mayans. I think that one is a Babylonian one. It might be Egyptian one. And now I don't remember exactly, but at least one of those other three is a Celtic calendar. So clearly, a calendar is a very specific cultural artifact. It has some specific utility, and it has been developed in many cultures independently of each other. So these data points suggest that in the event of a social collapse, we should expect, even in the absence of doomsday shelters, the re-emergence of a civilization that can produce calendars. However, we need to make some qualifications here. And one is that, contrary to biological evolution, cultural evolution allows for massive horizontal transfer of norms. So typically, when you have traders that go to Japan, and they can easily import a lot of cultural norms or cultural practices from they easily do this. Thus, post 1492, we have few instances of genuine isolation. So our evidence of convergent evolution cannot extend beyond that, because that would be the horizontal transfer of norms pollutes the evidence. Second, let's see here. Second, it helps to be more specific. Calendars are a good example; they're quite specific. And third, generality. So it seems like these cultures, more or less, all appeared in specific environments, namely river valleys in known Arctic areas. So this seems to be a contingency that's necessary for agricultural societies or civilizations to emerge. So I think some tentative conclusions can be drawn at this point, and that's post a social collapse or a resetting of the tape of history, we should expect agricultural societies to emerge. Given that the climate conditions allow, the climate conditions that are present in the colored parts of this map, and given that there are suitable river valleys. However, we don't seem to have any evidence of the robustness of industrialization. Industrialization happened only once in isolation, and we simply have no other data point that suggests that industrialization is an outcome that should be expected after a resetting of the tape of history. Thus, in the absence of a refuge, I think we should lend at least some probability, a substantial probability, that a reset may prevent rather than just delay technological maturity. And I also think we can draw the conclusion that it's likely to be a major rather than a minor delay on technological maturity or a modern civilization. What about similarity? Okay. I'm going to speed up a bit. Okay, so I previously talked about degrees of freedom. And that was, if you remember, whether the environment imposes severe constraints on possible solutions to problems. But back then I was talking about animals. What about degrees of freedom and humans? Well, there are two things that seem to impose constraints. One of them is climate. So some climatic areas seem to be much more constrictive of cultural practices than others. For example, Arctic environments provide little variety in terms of tools to use for hunting or doing stuff, and little variety of food sources. So we should expect that two Arctic civilizations that develop independent of each other at the same technological level should be more similar to each other than two civilizations that develop independently of each other on the same technological level, but on temperate climates. Because temperate climates would allow for more variety and diversity in terms of environmental constraints and so on. But I think the major thing to consider when looking at degrees of freedom of the variety of solutions to problems is technology. So in essence, technology allows us to control nature in various ways, to reduce the kind of constraints of nature on us. As an example, you can see here two people that seem to have kind of a very simple material conditions or simple technology, and people on this level of technology simply carry objects in two different ways, on their heads or on their backs. These people seem to be carrying stuff on their backs. So Neolithics, this is what Neolithic civilizations do. If we just jump a few thousand years in technological development, we get to the Bronze Age, and we immediately find a much larger variety of ways of solving this particular problem, transporting stuff. You know, you have sledge, wagon, horse, raft, etc. And of course, modern humans have a very wide variety of solutions to the problem of how to carry things. So it seems like, other things being equal, being more technologically advanced allows you to solve problems in a more diverse variety of ways. If this is true, then it implies that two Bronze Age civilizations should be more similar to each other than two medieval civilizations, all other things being equal. And this, in turn, seems to imply that if there would be a cultural discontinuity, that is, if instead of thinking of two civilizations that evolve independently of each other, we think about the same thing but across time. So we think about this new civilization developing without having any contact with ours, because ours disappeared. If this civilization manages to become modern, we should expect it to be very different from ours with respect to solving the problems that the environment poses on them. In other words, we should expect that a modern civilization, if it were to arise, and I don't think I wouldn't say that it's unlikely that they would arise, but if they would arise, they would likely be very different from us. Note that I'm still assuming that they're going to have the same kind of problems that we have. So I haven't assumed that they have other problems that we don't have. So I'm still assuming that they need to eat, they need to look good, they need to sleep, they need to be safe, they need to transport things, and so on and so forth. But it's just that the discontinuity and their assumed level of technology allows for a huge variety, such that they're very likely to be different from us. So yeah, the conclusion is that doomsday shelters could be quite cost effective. But what I haven't answered, and I think we need more research into, is to what would make a refuge or a doomsday shelter more effective of withstanding social collapse. Because I've just said about how bad it would be without, or in the absence of a shelter, but that doesn't necessarily mean that my idea for a shelter is a good one. But perhaps we can come up with such a good idea. Thank you.
All right, questions?
A few slides ago, you said that a more complicated technology world would have more differences. Did you mean that in an absolute percentage sense? So if there's 100 features of medieval situation and 1,000 features of industrial civilization, do you mean to say that there's numerically just more features of which are different, or is it larger as a percentage of all features? Just because there's more things to describe, there's more things to be different, or is it really percentage-wise more different?
So I suppose that, of course, you could slice up those features a bit differently. So if we, if we kind of assume that we can hold the number of features constant by kind of lumping together solutions, so to speak, then that's what I'm claiming. And I was a bit surprised that this claim is actually empirically testable. So we could go to the sources and to investigate, at least with regards to Bronze Age civilizations, because in Middle Ages we still had some civilizations that I think were relatively isolated from each other. So I think what would be really interesting, if there's an economic historian here, would be to investigate, for example, whether Bronze Age Great Britain and Bronze Age Japan were more similar than medieval Britain and medieval Japan. And by similar, I just simply mean like, if we take an arbitrary problem that could be solved, like getting water, or farming, or something like that, or warfare. How much do these differ with regards to function, like social organization, norms, methods, and so on? So I'm not sure I answered your question.
Maybe said yes.
Okay.
Do you think that sending libraries will be effective to transmit our culture to the next human civilization after the catastrophe? Or will you also send not library, but movies or even people who carry our culture?
So the refuge that I talked about, or that I described in a previous paper, had not only a library, but also people in that library. So this is kind of goes into another paper that I'm writing, but I see great difficulties in transmitting knowledge and understanding across when there's a major discontinuity. So as an example, we were only able to decipher the Egyptian hieroglyphs after the Rosetta Stone was found. And we still don't know if we don't know if we could have done it in the absence of the Rosetta Stone. Even though, we had quite ample information about the Egyptians, and we knew a bit about their history and so on. So it seems like if you have this kind of radical discontinuity, maybe libraries are not going to be much help. It's better than nothing, absolutely. But I think you also need people that can preserve this discontinuity. Preserve the continuity.
So there was a question over there, and there, then there. So let's start over here.
So my question is a bit similar. It strikes me that the kind of refuge that we would need would be paper-based, because all other forms of encoded information are much more likely to degrade over time or become incompatible with the machinery that we use. But then the problem with paper is that it takes a lot of space, and you can't keep that much information together in paper as you could with other means. But also thinking about the library, if there was some sort of major catastrophe, the things we would most want to know how to do, perhaps it would be readily found in the library. It might be like how to synthesize this kind of medication, or other sorts of basic scientific knowledge that are increasingly now being stored in a very dispersed way in papers here and there that are mostly existing in digital form. And I wonder if you had any ideas about some sort of criterion for the kind of information you want to be encoded and put into these huge scenarios.
So the paper I wrote about the refuge was more like general characteristics to make it work, because back then I was reading a lot of studies on the psychological impact of being isolated, underground, and generally stressed out, and you really don't want people to kill each other in the bunker. So that was kind of my first line of thought. I haven't thought that much about how to make the selection and so on. So that certainly needs to be done. What I'm thinking is that, and that's also why I suggested that this refuge, or why, I mean, there are lots of existing refuges. You have fallout shelters all over the United States, also in many post-Soviet countries and so on. But of course, they don't have these multiple redundancy libraries or other kinds of means to store knowledge and information over the long term. So the kind of refuge I was envisioning was a kind of something in the cost or a kind of general cost class as a large nuclear submarine or something like that, rather than a kind of a hole in the ground. And the argument would be that even a nuclear submarine is orders of magnitude cheaper than a base on Mars.
Yes. In your discussion about convergent and divergent evolution, I think one aspect you maybe didn't bring up is that these huge events like asteroids or lava eruptions, they change the environment and thus they change the evolutionary pressure. And that sort of brings back to the question of the restart of society, because everything we use to build our society, all the easily available materials, they're already gone. So how would we handle that?
Right. So I think this has partly been discussed by Seth. Things could be even more difficult than this, as you suggest, because resources could be depleted, or there could be some environmental hazard, or the climate might be much more unstable, or it could be quite different. So all those are things that could further complicate this. So in this discussion, I'm just making as rosy a picture as possible, like the world is just as nice as it's today, or even nicer than it is today, but we still have reason to be, well, we don't have good reasons to believe that civilization would reemerge, even under like these good conditions. So I kind of come into that in the paper when I mentioned the contingency on specific environments. So all these these civilizations, they need river valleys. So if the climate is, for example, too dry, then you're gonna get a problem with this.